been wonderful.
Any Mother's Day plans? It's coming up real soon. You gonna do anything for her?
Of course. Of course, she's a terrific mom.
All I need is kisses.
Keith Urban's joining us right now. And
Nice to talk to you, Al.
Right,
If you've just joined us, we're talking about sleep cycles.
I love
Who's
that.
not sleeping enough? Call in. Don't call in.
I can imagine.
Real, Ellen.
I know.
It must feel a bit Twilight Zone-ish.
It is. It's, it's so weird how that day finally comes.
After
Like, I've been
almost 20 years of marriage, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman announced their separation. No scandal, no betrayal, just a deafening silence that shook Hollywood. What really happened with one of entertainment's most powerful couples? For the first time, the complete story. From humble origins in Australia to the painful decision that no one saw coming. Are you enjoying this story? Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman. Then help the channel with your subscription. Look, 94.8% of the people who watch these videos are still not subscribed to the channel. If you are part of that group, take the chance and subscribe now. It's free, and that way you'll keep receiving amazing stories from TV shows we still miss. Oh, and don't forget, at the end of the video, you'll find more stories like this one. There are chords that sound like confessions and silences that tell entire stories. Keith Urban carries both in the calloused palms of his hands. At 57, sitting under the golden lights of a Nashville studio, he is no longer the boy who dreamed of applause, but a man who learned that true music begins when the noise ceases. His face, marked by time, tells stories that his songs merely hint at. Of a boy from rural Australia who transformed pain into melody, of a man who danced with demons and survived to sing about it, and of a heart that found and lost love, only to discover something deeper in the void that remained. There is no script for a life like his, only major and minor chords, weaving together a symphony of beautiful mistakes and difficult truths that somehow sound like redemption. Born in Whangarei, New Zealand on October 26, 1967, Keith Lionel Urban took his first breaths among green hills that seemed to sing with the wind. But it was in Caboolture, Australia, a small town in Queensland where the sky seems endless, that his hands first found the strings that would change his life. His father, Robert, sold musical instruments part-time, bringing home used guitars that seemed like treasures to the boy's eyes. His mother, Mary Ann, filled the house with the sounds of Dolly Parton and Johnny Cash, American voices that crossed oceans to cradle her son's dreams. The walls of that modest house vibrated with promises that would one day cross continents. At 4 years old, a ukulele already seemed an extension of his small fingers. At 6, a guitar nearly larger than himself became his constant companion. While other children played in the yard, Keith sat for hours, repeating chords until his fingers ached, then continued a bit longer. At school, he was the quiet kid, the strange one who preferred melodies to games, who dreamed of Nashville while his classmates talked about football. Music, he would say years later, was the only language in which I didn't stutter. In a world where he never felt completely at home, the 6 strings of his guitar offered the first true shelter. At 12, something happened that Keith would never forget. His father, realizing his son's talent had outgrown cheap instruments, mortgaged the family home to buy a professional guitar. "Make it worth it," Robert said, handing over the instrument that cost more than they could afford. It was such a pure act of faith that Keith still gets emotional talking about it decades later. On that guitar, he learned not just to play, but to honor sacrifices, to transform expectations into determination. Every note he drew from those strings was a silent promise to his father. "I will not disappoint you." At 15, while his friends were discovering parties and first loves, Keith was already performing in local bars. Too young to drink, but old enough to understand that music could be a passage to another world. He stood on beer-sticky floors, singing to strangers who barely paid attention, but he played as if each note could alter the course of his life. And, in a way, it could. It was on those improvised stages that he learned the difference between playing an instrument and making music, between singing a song and telling a story. "You learn who you are on those nights," he would say later. You learn if you're doing this for love or for applause. When he finished school, while his classmates followed conventional paths of universities and stable jobs, Keith packed his guitar and his dreams. With a kiss on his mother's cheek and a tight hug from his father, he departed, carrying with him only the certainty that he was born for something more than Caboolture could offer. "I'll make it worth it," he promised, words that would sound like a mantra in the difficult years to come. He didn't know then that he was starting a journey that would lead him not just to bigger stages, but to the depths of himself. Nashville. For an Australian boy in love with country music, the name sounded like a prayer. The promised land where the streets, they said, were paved with possibilities, and where pain could be transformed into gold. When Keith Urban finally arrived there in 1992, at 24 years old, he discovered a harsher truth. Nashville didn't easily welcome dreamers. The city was full of talents like him, all chasing the same miracle. He slept in cheap apartments with thin walls where the hum of air conditioners mingled with the sound of distant guitars. He recorded demos for other singers, played as a backing musician for artists who barely noticed his presence, and sold his instruments more than once to pay rent. Days turned into months, and months into years. Nashville tested his faith but never completely broke it. There were moments when he almost gave up, when the distance between dream and reality seemed insurmountable. On lonely nights, the memory of the mortgaged house and his father's calloused hands was what kept him going. He couldn't return empty-handed. He couldn't surrender when so many had believed in him. So he continued, writing songs on bar napkins, learning to transform rejection into determination, loneliness into creativity. Finally, after years of closed doors, one opened. His first album didn't change the world, but it changed his world. Suddenly, there were people listening to his songs, connecting with his stories. Success didn't come like lightning, but like a gradual tide that slowly began to rise. Each song, each performance, each new fan was a validation of the boy from Caboolture who had bet everything on music. Radio stations began to play his songs, audiences grew, and the name Keith Urban began to mean something in the country scene. But like so many before him, Keith discovered that success brings its own demons. The pressure to stay relevant, growing expectations, lonely nights in hotel rooms in unknown cities, all of this took a toll. Alcohol, initially a comfort, became a necessity, then a prison. The same hands that created such beautiful music now trembled seeking the next drink. The spotlights he had so desired now seemed to expose his fragilities. On the outside, he was the image of success, the Australian boy who had conquered Nashville. Inside, he was crumbling. His addiction peaked just as his career was taking off. The songs played on the radio, fans shouted his name, but Keith was increasingly distant from himself. That's when he made the decision that would save his life: to seek help. In 1998, he entered rehabilitation for the first time, facing his demons head-on. It was a painful process, stripping away illusions, looking at himself in the mirror without filters. Recovery, he would say later, isn't just about stopping something destructive. It's about learning to build something better in its place. Sobriety didn't come easily. There were relapses, moments of weakness, but there was also a new clarity in his music, an honesty that resonated more deeply with those who listened. It was in this period of rebirth that Keith Urban met Nicole Kidman, the Hollywood star with eyes that seemed to hold their own secrets. They met in 2005 at an event for Australians in Los Angeles, two expatriates who had conquered America in their own way. The connection was immediate. Two artists who understood the weight of fame, the loneliness of applause. Perhaps that's what brought them together. The mutual recognition of souls who had learned that success, by itself, doesn't fill the empty spaces within us. Are you enjoying this story? Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman. Then help the channel with your subscription. Look, 94.8% of the people who watch these videos are still not subscribed to the channel. If you are part of that group, take the chance and subscribe now. It's free, and that way you'll keep receiving amazing stories from TV shows we still miss. Oh, and don't forget, at the end of the video, you'll find more stories like this one. Marriage came quickly in June 2006, a ceremony in Sydney that seemed to seal a modern fairy tale. The country musician and the Hollywood princess. The photos showed radiant smiles, passionate gazes, promises of forever that seemed unshakable. And for a time, perhaps they were. They formed a powerful couple, dazzling on red carpets, intimate in private moments that the public only glimpsed. Then came the daughters, Sunday Rose in 2008 and Faith Margaret in 2010, completing the picture of the perfect family that tabloids loved to portray. Together, they seemed invincible. Two stars who had found in each other a safe harbor in the whirlwind of fame. But fame has a cruel way of transforming love into spectacle. Keith and Nicole lived under the constant gaze of the public, each gesture analyzed, each absence noted. They spent long periods apart, she filming in distant locations, he on tours that crossed continents. The same love songs that moved crowds carried the weight of lonely nights in hotel rooms, of missed birthdays, of moments that couldn't be recovered. True love, they discovered, wasn't like in Nicole's movies or Keith's songs. It was more complex, more difficult, demanded more than just feeling. At 57, Keith Urban found a new voice. Not just as a musician, but as a man. His performances changed. Less production, more intimacy. He no longer needed the fireworks and blinding lights. He sat alone on stage with his guitar, telling stories between songs, laughing at his past mistakes, celebrating his scars. The audience could feel the difference. It was no longer just entertainment, it was communion. Each note carried the weight of lived experience. Each pause contained truths that didn't need to be explained. His new albums abandoned the polished shine of production for a raw vulnerability. In a track called The Hard Way Home, he sang about forgiveness without naming names, about healing without pretending it didn't hurt. Fans instantly felt it. This was no longer the Keith Urban who sang about wild love and reckless joy. This was the Keith Urban who had lived enough to know that peace often follows surrender. I used to think that love was about holding on, he said during a concert, his voice trembling slightly. Now I think it's about knowing when to let go and still wishing them peace. The audience fell silent. Some wiping away tears, realizing they were hearing something sacred. Not a performance, but a man laying down the last of his armor. Keith began to talk about emotional sobriety, the idea that healing isn't just abstaining from what harms, but learning to live fully without needing to numb oneself. The hardest addiction to break, he would say, is the addiction to control, to thinking you can shape life according to your will. You can't. You just have to keep showing up honestly every day. The hidden truth was simple and profound. Keith Urban had stopped performing for survival. Every lyric, every note, every public word was now an act of presence. He was no longer chasing validation. He was practicing devotion. Not to fame, not even to love, but to life itself. I used to think happiness was applause, he confessed to an interviewer. Now I think it's being able to go home, sit with yourself, and not need anyone to tell you who you are. And that became his new gospel. Quiet, luminous, hard-won. In Nashville, those who saw him in recent times described him as lighter, calmer. He still laughed easily, still told jokes, still played like a man possessed, but his music now had an undercurrent of serenity, the sound of a storm that had finally learned to rest. When he sang, it wasn't to prove he had survived, but to remind others that they could too. Perhaps that was the truest confession of all, that the real miracle of Keith Urban's story wasn't fame or success or even love. It was forgiveness, for himself, for the past, for the boy who once thought happiness lived on a stage. He found it, instead, in silence. In his last show before taking an extended break, Keith ended with a song that didn't exist on any album. It was just him and his guitar, no lights, no drums. He called it Still Here, and the lyrics were simple, almost fragile. I broke in half just to learn how to bend. I lost what I loved just to love it again. And if the world forgets my name or my song, I'll still be here, where I belonged all along. Every night when he sang these words, the audience fell into reverent silence. There were no roars, shouts, or frenzy, just the collective heartbeat of people who understood, who had lost, endured, and forgiven themselves too. When the final show ended, Keith didn't announce a farewell. He simply walked off stage, handed his guitar to a crew member, and disappeared into the darkness behind the curtains. Outside, the Nashville night waited, a soft and familiar hum, with the same sound it carried on the day he arrived, decades ago, young and terrified. He breathed, looked at the stars, and smiled. The sky was vast and endless. He felt small again, and that felt like freedom. Later that year, in a quiet interview near a candlelit porch, a journalist asked him, "After everything, fame, love, loss, what do you think is the meaning of it all?" Keith thought for a long moment, watching fireflies dance through the Tennessee night. Then he said, "It's all just music. The mistakes, the miracles, they're all part of the same song. You just have to keep playing." He paused and softly added, "And if you're lucky, someone you loved will still be humming along too." The camera lingered on his face, now with lines carved by laughter and pain, and for a brief moment he seemed almost translucent, like a spirit halfway between the past and peace. Behind him, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint echo of a melody that seemed eternal. And when the screen darkened, you could almost hear his voice, tender and endless, whispering the final line of his life's chorus. "Every song I ever wrote was just my way of saying I'm still here." Are you enjoying this story? Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman? Then help the channel with your subscription. Look, 94.8% of the people who watch these videos are still not subscribed to the channel. If you are part of that group, take the chance and subscribe now. It's free, and that way you'll keep receiving amazing stories from TV shows we still miss. And don't forget, at the end of the video, you'll find more stories like this one. This is the truth he finally admitted. Not scandal, nor sadness, but serenity. Not the end of love, but its transformation. The boy who once dreamed of Nashville found something much greater than fame or forgiveness. He found quietness. And in that quietness, Keith Urban remains, not as an idol, not as a myth, but as a man who transformed his wounds into music, his silence into peace, and his love into something that will never stop singing.